on the internet?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, cool. You now know how to use the internet. Congratulations. That's great. So today, as you know, we are going to be covering insects. For the first portion of class, we'll be hearing from Matt, who I'll introduce in a second. Then we'll do break, and we'll do activities, and then we'll have a half-hour session at the end where we talk about the final project. Some things to note about the break is that we have a bunch of books out in the hallway. We have a wonderful, wonderful Emeritus Master Gardener, Kit Flynn, who is trying to clean out her book collection. So these are the good ones. So check out those books, take whatever you want. Those are just free for you guys to have. And then during the break in the snack room, we will have a couple of initial projects from previous years laid out for you to look at. So you can see examples of kind of what that is. And so you can kind of be thinking about what questions you might have for that last half hour when we're doing a little bit of a Q&A about the initial project. So just take a look at those during the break, just to get yourself oriented a little bit. Do we have any questions about any of that? Awesome. Are we all feeling okay? Cool. It's a beautiful day out. It's not hard to feel okay. So today we are so excited. Matt is a celebrity in Master Gardener world, which is fun. You will probably see him a fair bit on Plants, Pests, and Pathogens if you ever start tuning into that. That's one of our monthly seminars that the state program puts on. He's the director of the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic, an amazing insect photographer, really phenomenal. Just seems to know all things fun insect facts. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ashley. No, I do not know everything about insects, but I know a lot, I guess, and I love critters, as you'll hear, even the pests sometimes. But thanks for introducing me. So I'm going to talk to you today about some important landscape pests you should know. These are common groups that you're going to see out there. Obviously, I can't cover every arthropod in an hour. North Carolina probably has about 10,000 species of arthropods at least, if not more. What is an arthropod? Does anybody know? I like to say I like to eat some arthropods, but not most.
It's absolutely having an exoskeleton.
So, yep, exoskeleton is one characteristic of them. Anybody else? So what are some examples of arthropods?
Insects.
Crayfish are an arthropod. Insects are. Spiders. So shrimp and lobsters and crabs, those are the ones I like to eat. And things like that. So critters, lots of legs often, stuff like that. So I'm going to talk about them, and I'm talking about arthropods because it's not just insects that are pests out there, as you'll see. So there's so many different groups that affect different plants. I'm going to talk about most of the common ones, but because ornamentals, especially in the landscape, are so diverse, different groups of arthropods feed on them. So I can't cover everything that's out there. If you do encounter something that you don't know, you can ask Ashley, you can look online, or you can always send me some photos through the clinic. How many of you all know about the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic? Yeah, okay. Well, so it's a lab at NC State, so we do identify and diagnose plant diseases and insect pests, also of homes, I do. I'm the one who identifies all of the critters from all the situations, and we can basically, you submit samples, we can send you reports. This is for your clients. There's a reduced fee for coming through you all, and you also might be able to answer those questions for them anyway. But if you're stuck on it or whatever, you can send pictures, especially with insects and other arthropods, larger ones, you can send photos, and if they're clear, I should be able to tell you what it is, and that's free. But anyway, we're a service to help diagnose these things. So, first I'm going to start off with true bugs. So, I will allow people to say bug, but all bugs are insects, but not all insects are bugs. Does anybody know what a true bug is and what makes a true bug a bug?
3 sets of legs.
No, so that's an insect. So they typically, yep. So this is a subgroup. This is an order of insects. You'll be reading in your handbook that these have sucking mouth parts. That's the major characteristic of them. So they can't chew on things. They can't chew on solid food. They suck liquids. But what kinds of organisms have liquids in them? Plants. What about us? Yeah, so bed bugs are a true bug, and they suck our blood. So they can basically, since most organisms are full of liquids, these things are very successful. And because plants are sitting there and helpless, these things get on them and suck. So one thing to start out with is honeydew. So a lot of these insect pests feed on this sap. The sap is full of lots of water and sugar, but they also have muscles and nerves and all that stuff like we do, and so they need proteins and fats and things like that. Now, if they were to try and digest all that liquid to get all those nutrients, they would explode. So that what they do is they actually filter out the sugar water and eject it out their rear end. It's excrement, it's like urine, but it's actually just sugar water. And so you can see there the droplet on the sharpshooter nymph. Sometimes you can see it raining down from trees, or if you park under a tree in the summer, you get the little sticky spots on your car. That's what's happening. So basically, it's just bug pee. But some things like bug pee a lot. So ants. So if you see ants, and also sometimes other things, creatures like wasps and flies and stuff like that, they really like this sugary source of food. A lot of those insects can only feed on liquids. And so these ants will tend to sucking insects like this. So ants don't eat plants. So if there's ants going up and down your tree or your plants, follow them up and you're going to find some kind of colony of some kind of sucking insect probably that's producing this honeydew, and they're guarding it like they're cattle, kind of like dairy cattle. And so they'll kind of keep other insects from feeding on them, parasitoids from killing them, things like that. So they are, the ants are promoting those because they want the sugar water, but it's going to obviously make them worse on your plants. Another thing that likes to eat honeydew is sooty molds. So these are superficial molds that grow on the surface where the honeydew lands. And so when this builds up, you know that you have an infestation of some kind of honeydew producing insect. And it's not a pathogen. You can see it flakes off the surfaces. It's just growing on that substrate, but it can interfere with photosynthesis. It makes the plants look dingy and bad. And one thing to note is that just because one plant has the sooty mold on it does not mean that's the plant with the insects. So you could have a tree above a bush and it's got aphids on it, rain down the honeydew onto that bush below. That bush is going to have the sooty mold. So you want to scout around the area for those insects that are producing that honeydew. Okay, so now let's get into some of these insects. So aphids. How many of you all have never seen an aphid? Okay. So yes, everybody knows about them. They're small, soft-bodied insects. Typically live in groups. You rarely just see one aphid. They come in winged and wingless forms. It's not like male, female, or anything like that. Typically, it's when the population grows to a certain size, they produce winged forms to disperse. But they do have really complicated life cycles. Some are fairly simple, but many of them shift hosts. So some will overwinter on woody hosts. They'll create galls, and then the next generation that comes out will transition to herbaceous hosts and things like that, and then to have a different life cycle. They also reproduce asexually at first, typically, but usually in the fall and the winter, they lay eggs on trees, and that's what I should ask is how many of you have ever seen an aphid egg? See, so you've seen a lot of aphids, but you've never seen eggs of them. So it's because most of the year they're producing live young. The main characteristic for them is these cornicles or siphuncules, these little kind of tailpipes on them. You can see on that one there's this yellow on the tip. That's a dried alarm pheromone. So they produce these chemicals out of those to warn others that they're being attacked. Some have shorter cornicles, so be careful. Some don't have them, but most aphids will have these long kind of tailpipes on their rear end. Some will produce wax or galls, and they do produce a lot of honeydew, one of the most common pests producing honeydew, and many transmit diseases, viruses especially. So over 50% of all viruses transmitted to plants by insects are transmitted by aphids. Potyviruses especially, and things like that. I'm not going to talk about any specifically because they come in so many different forms. This is one species, but they come in pink and green, so color isn't a good way to ID them necessarily. We have ones with racing stripes, ones that produce wax all over them. That's a giant bark aphid, which that's on an acorn, and you can see how big that aphid is. It's huge. And then you can see the wingless and winged aphids down there. So they are highly variable in size, color, and form. And if you wanted me to ID the species, some of them are fairly distinct. Others, what I would have to do is actually slide mount them and look at little characteristics on them to ID them. But typically control is similar for them, and this is my time to tell you that I'm not going to talk about killing them or anything like that. That's basically identification is your first step. Once you ID them, you can look online for all this stuff. I'm an expert in ID, not in killing them like that. I kill them in other ways for collection and stuff. But basically, you know, if you don't know what pest you have no way to access the information on how to control it, because certain pests are controlled by certain things and similar lookalikes might not be. And I'll give you an example later on. Now, jumping plant lice are another group of sucking insects, it's bugs. They look like little tiny cicadas with long antennae. They're only a few millimeters long. They're typically host specific, so if you know what type of plant you have, you can usually identify the type of plant louse you have. But this is one where the young look very different than the grown-ups, so they can be very different looking. And there's several different groups out there. Some cause galls, some do transmit plant diseases, things like that. But the one that I want you all to know about is the boxwood psyllid. So this is the least common of the 3 boxwood pests I'm going to mention today, but it can be out there. And so you can see that's the nymph. It's got the little wing pads. It hasn't grown up into an adult, and it's producing this wax. But they're tiny. You can see how tiny they are on a boxwood leaf. So these things feed on the new growth. They cause the growth to cup around them so they can have nice little shelter to feed in. And so if you see that new growth cupping, opening up, they do produce honeydew also and the wax. And a lot of these bugs produce wax. One hypothesis is that this helps keep them the honeydew repelled from them so they don't get all sticky and everything. It's like if you're producing syrup, you want to have a way to get it away from you. They don't cause permanent damage or death to the plants, but they make it look bad, obviously, the tips. But there are lots of different ones. One you might see around if you have Yopon hollies, they create galls on them. It's a different family. It's not psyllid. It is a jumping plant louse. But if you see little kind of cupped leaves on the Yopon hollies, that's a psyllid that causes that. Okay, whiteflies. How many of you all have experienced whiteflies? A few people, yeah. On what? Any? What's that? Kale. Kale. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So these are little tiny white insects. The adults are waxy. They're covered in the dusting of wax. Almost no wing venation. Very tiny little insects. And there are several species that are serious pests. They have a crawler stage that doesn't look anything like the adult, and then they have a resting pupil stage. And then we put pupil in quotes there. And you can actually see here, this is an adult next to its pupa, so it would have emerged from one of those. And doesn't, you would never think that those are the same thing. But actually the pupae are really distinct, and so we identify them based on the pupae. Now does anybody know why I put pupae in quotes? Does anybody know what a pupa is?
Because these aren't going through an exact definition of metamorphosis.
Yep, exactly. So they don't go through complete metamorphosis like a butterfly, like caterpillar, pupa, the chrysalis. The pupa is the resting stage in between the young, the larva, and the adult. So true bugs aren't technically holometabolists is what we call it. So they don't go through complete metamorphosis. But a few groups seem like it. So they change drastically. So that's why we kind of call it pupa. We'll get to thrips later on, but they have a similar thing where they have a resting stage and stuff. So we call them larvae and pupae, but it's not technically correct. But anyway, so you can see they're very different there. Oftentimes, these do produce a lot of honeydew, and oftentimes, if you just shake the plant, you see little white insects fluttering around, that's, you have whiteflies. But if you're not sure you have honeydew, you're not seeing the adults, but you want to take a look for these pupae. And so we'll go over just 2 species that you might find around. So the first is the citrus whitefly. And so it does attack many plants, it does survive outdoors here. The pupae are very flat and coin-like with a kind of a yellow Y on them. So that's how you identify the whiteflies, whitefly larvae, young. And you can see that's on the petiole of a lemon leaf. So basically they're very tiny, only a couple millimeters wide. On citrus whitefly, typically it's on a bunch of different hosts. I tend to see it mostly on gardenia, privet, and sometimes ash. Those are the kinds of ones you see, but it can get on lots of different hosts. And they do produce a lot of honeydew. So if your gardenia is dingy looking, it's almost certainly going to be this. This is like the most common honeydew producing insect on gardenia, for instance. Another whitefly is the greenhouse whitefly. So this one is a little bit more three-dimensional. It's kind of raised up off the surface, and it's got a crown of hairs around it. And this is on the bottom of a tomato leaf, a very small tomato leaf, so you can see how tiny they are. They're only, again, a couple millimeters wide. This isn't as common in the outdoors, except for in the warmer periods, but they can become more common indoors. And there's a few other types of whiteflies out there that attack plants. There's some that are the pupae are like jet black. We'll see that on Nandina and mulberry and a few other groups and stuff like that. But yeah, whiteflies are another really important group of sucking insects that do produce honeydew as well. And actually some whiteflies do transmit viruses to agricultural plants and things like that. So again, a lot of these sucking insects, the viruses evolved to kind of be vectored by them. Okay, now scale insects are a hugely diverse group of insects that don't really look like insects. You would just pass by them. It's not like people are out there taking photos of them like butterflies and stuff like that. Except for me, I'm the one that takes the photos of them. But scale insects are really interesting. Very small, most of them lack obvious features of a typical insect. They start off as crawlers with legs. This is the kind of the dispersal form. They can get blown around with wind. They can crawl up. They usually just crawl up the plant and infest other places. They can hitch rides on animals and things like that. Very tiny, and when males and females will crawl to an area, feed, and the males will become this fly-like insect that will then go off and disperse and mate with the females, because the females will stay in that spot typically for the rest of their life. There are some more mobile scales, as we'll talk about in a minute, but most of them, many of the groups, they just, once they settle, they're there for their life. They do often require side mounting to ID, and species can have broad or narrow host ranges. Some are really just restricted to one type of plant, others can feed on all different types of plants. And here's just an example down there. That fly-like thing is the male, and it's resting on top of the female, which is that disc. So completely what we call this sexual dimorphism, where the two different sexes are very, very different. And this is very common. This is the norm for scale insects. One of them is the cottony cushion scale. This is one of the most famous scale insects. It was introduced in the US in the late 1800s, and it had huge efforts to bring in biocontrol agents to kill it. But it infests a lot of different plants. It's a more primitive type of scale, so it actually has big legs and antennae and stuff like that. But like many other scales, they produce this wax, and these produce these very large wax ovisacs, which is basically like a sac to contain the eggs. They do feed on a variety of plants. I've seen them on Nandina, Pittosporum, and Fatsia around, but they can be on a lot of different plants. Typically kind of here or there, or kind of around kind of mid veins, things like that. And they do get fairly large. I would say about a quarter or a third of an inch, which is huge for a scale. So cottony cushion scale. We're going to talk about another one that's similar looking, but not the same, so don't confuse them. But again, the big black legs, antennae, stuff like that are diagnostic. Now, a whole group of scales that you're going to see out there are called the soft scales. So soft scales, they do start off kind of flattened and soft, but as many of them, as they grow up, especially the females, they're going to kind of inflate and then produce their eggs under them, and they become very hard and kind of warty looking. And so each one of those is an individual scale insect. Some are only present indoors or in greenhouses. They can be common on some indoor plants, especially like staghorn fern gets a lot of soft scale, brown soft scale, things like that. One way to ID these specifically, which you have to look at really closely with a hand lens or a microscope or whatever, is they have an anal cleft and a triangular anal plate. So there's basically there's a cleft right there, and then some plates right there. And this group does produce large amounts of honeydew. So these can be a contributor to honeydew. And so just a few species that you might be seeing out there, or groups that you might be seeing out there. So the tulip tree scale is one of the biggest ones, and typically soft scales are kind of a moderate sized scale. There are some smaller ones, but they do get pea size. This is about the size of a pea, kind of resting on tulip poplar. Lecanium scales are common on oaks. So especially on stressed oaks, or if you go around and look at the oaks, especially around the city, you're going to find a lot of these kind of brown warts on them, which are the Licanium scales. The wax scales are typically only kind of they're not usually dense on plants, but they can be found on there. They look like little white pieces of like popcorn or wax that's just sitting on the plant. If you took it off, you'd find out that the insect itself is red, and if you squish it, it bleeds red, but the outside is kind of like dried toothpaste. It's like this really thick wax that they produce. And this is called the barnacle scale, particularly because it looks like a barnacle almost. And then you got the cottony scales. So this is not to be confused with the cottony cushion scales, and these are far more common. And the cottony scales, the ovisac that it's producing gets 2 or 3 times that length sometimes, and you'll see them, and they get on lots of different hosts. The cottony camellia scales on camellia, hollies, and depending on if I've ID'd it right in some ways, I've seen it on like poison ivy and yews and things like that. So they can be on a lot of things, and they do produce honeydew and can cause sooty mold. So oftentimes when you see hollies that are kind of dingy looking, this is the most common cause of that. So these are soft scales. Another group of scales are the mealybugs. So these are covered in mealy wax and usually have these kind of rays coming out of them. They look almost like a sun. And they have these special glands that produce the wax that kind of just, it kind of goes out, produced from there. They're a pretty important family. Some do transmit viruses, not often here. I don't often see them in landscapes causing a lot of damage, but we have had situations like that. I would say indoors and in greenhouses, they become more of a problem. But they're fairly mobile, so they have little legs and they can move around a little bit more than the typical, those other scales. Again, there are some root feeding forms. In fact, I just ID'd some from a greenhouse. It's actually a different group of, different family of mealybugs. They have relationships with ants. These do produce honeydew as well, and so you will see sometimes a city mold and whatever. And then probably the most important family of scales are the armored scales. And so these produce this covering here. So this is actually an azalea twig, and they have started to, they basically develop and kind of insert themselves under the bark. So you would never know they were there until you see the lumpiness, and then you say, oh, you pry it off. You pry off the shell, and you get that female sitting there. Now, that's the female when they're cleared of a different species, and then you can see it has no legs, nothing. These right here are the antennae. This is the mouth parts. Basically, they just tap into the plant and rest, and they're the most advanced of all the scales because they've lost everything. They're really specialized at doing that stuff. So they produce this covering, this test, what it's called, but this is one group. This is one important thing to know. This group does not produce honeydew. So why is that?
Because it's covered.
It's covered, yeah. So these actually, I don't know what came first, but these actually use their kind of worm-like mouth parts to feed on individual cells in the plant. So they don't actually tap into the sap system, the vascular system. So they don't actually get all that extra sugar water. So they don't actually have to produce this. So armored scales would not be causing honeydew issues like city mold and things like that. They may be present around there, but they're not going to be the ones causing that. And now when I have to ID them, I have to look at the little structures in the tail end of it basically on a microscope slide. And this group of scales is relatively small. They're only a millimeter to a couple millimeters at most in size. So they're very difficult to identify, but once you do, you'll see them encrusting plants and things like that. And they're sometimes associated with a fungus called a felt fungus, Septobasidium. So sometimes, especially this time of year when there's no leaves on the plants, people are outside, they see this mat of tan or black fungus growing on a branch, and they're like, oh no, this is gonna kill my tree, or this is infecting. Well, what you do is you scrape that off a little bit, you look at the bark underneath. If the bark underneath is green, then that's probably a superficial fungus that's growing with these insects. They feed on the scale insects. The scale insects get some kind of protection, but there's, it's kind of a weird mutualism thing. But that fungus is only associated with these scales. So basically, if you see that fungus, you probably have these scales present. Another thing to note is that, yes?
So just to recap what
Yeah.
you just said so I get it. If you scrape under that fungus and it's green, meaning like you
Yeah.
see the green of
Yeah.
the twig or like the fungus underneath the top fungus is green?
Yeah, under the bark of the plant. So
Under
that's a
the
good
bark.
way to know whether you have a fungus that's infected the plant or not. So if it's a canker or something that's kind of fruiting out of the plant, when you cut under it, it's going to be dead because the fungus is eating the plant or whatever. So this is a good way to show that that fungus is just superficial. Same with the sooty mold. If you scrape it off, you know that it's just the leaf under there is still healthy and all that stuff. It's just a superficial thing. So yeah, good question.
So is that
Yeah.
a fungus that can infect, or is that always a superficial fungus that felt?
It's always a superficial fungus. It's only feeding on the scales. It does not care about the plant. It just happens to be there because the scales are on the plant. So great. Now, again, these produce males and females, and the females grow this test, and the test can be different shapes and sizes and stuff, and I'll show you that in a second. Males often have what I like to refer to, it looks like a little icing smear. They kind of have a little cocoon that they grow in, and out of that it's going to come this little fly-like insect. Almost all males of armor scales have a very similar look, or when they're developing. The funny thing is that sometimes people notice them more than the females because the females can be under the bark or can be camouflaged in. But when you see those white male pupae come, or cocoons around the tree, you say, oh, there's scale insect. Now the males aren't doing the damage, but that means there's females nearby. Now, with that, here's some very common species. So T-scale, very tiny, tiny scale, one of the smallest scales. Armor scales. So this is commonly found on camellia, of course. That's the tea plant. That's where tea comes from. And so if you see yellow chlorotic spot patches on your older leaves on your camellia, just flip it over. You're going to find this mealy wax on them, and then these these are the males and females here. If you look at cypresses, like arborvitae, things like that, you'll sometimes find minute cypress scale and the relatives. That shows a male and a female. Does anyone know which one is which?
The female is the round, blobby.
Yeah. So you can see the test there of the female is papery, looks like a fried egg. The male has that little kind of icing smear one, or whatever. And then contrast that to this, the euonymus scale. So cypress scales can be common. They're kind of, although they don't really cause as much damage. Euonymus scale can kill euonymus plants, and I think they get on pachysandra too. And so the females here, this oyster shell one, and the males there around are that little icing smear. So again, you may look at that and you not realize that those brown things are female insects that are feeding on the plant, but you'll notice all those males. And then gloomy scale is very common on maples. So that's, if you find a maple, especially in the city, you're gonna find gloomy scale. And you can see all those little, what's really interesting is that the first two nymphal stages don't produce the test. And so that's what this little golden thing is here, and these little eye things, these little eyeball here, the little kind of, what pupils there. That's the shed skins of the first two nymphs, and then underneath it, the older one will start to produce that kind of strange, and so you always get these kind of shed skins right there. So these are armor scales, and this is another one where treatment is different. You can't just spray these because they're covered in a shell. So this is one thing where you need to consider what type of insect you have. Okay, one other group of bugs, true bugs. Now there are lots of bugs out there. I'm not going to talk about stink bugs, things like that today, but lace bugs. So lace bugs are a really common bug that is not related to those scale insects and aphids and things like that. It's more closely related to stink bugs and stuff like that. But these all feed on plants. They're typically host specific, so if you know what plant you have, you can tell what species of lace bug you have. They are very beautiful little stained glass window insects. I will tell the cool things about them, like they're really good mothers. They guard their eggs even against spiders and stuff like that. But they do hang out on the undersides of leaves, and they lay their eggs sometimes in the leaf. Other species lay their eggs on top like little vases. But the damage, they cause a stippling damage where they're feeding, and they poop all over on the underside of the leaves. So they cause kind of, messes. And so, even though they're cute little insects, they can be damaging to plants. So the most common one you're going to see is the azalea lace bug. But you'll see that some azaleas, you'll have one here and one in a different spot, and you'll have completely different pressures of these pests. So they tend to like certain spots better than others. But there's all different species out there. There's ones that feed on oaks, sycamores. That's the chrysanthemum lace bug, feeds on asters and things like that. Okay, so let's talk about a couple wasps. So everybody loves wasps, right? I know, it's the worst thing to say, because, wasps, yeah, you just get it out of your mind that most wasps out there do not sting people. Most wasps that do sting people don't really want to, and honestly, if you get stung by some, you're probably deserving it. But anyway, so wasps are a group of insects in the order Hymenoptera. I'm not going to talk about ants. Ants are technically just ground nesting or whatever nesting social wasps that don't have wings, most of them. Bees are also technically a type of wasp. I'm not going to talk about them either, but bees are actually closely related to mud daubers and things like that, hunting wasps. They're just vegetarians. But the true vegetarian, and we don't really even call them wasps, are the sawflies. And so sawflies, they're not a fly, they're not really a wasp. They're basically a primitive, a basal group of Hymenoptera, this order that contains the wasps and bees and things like that. And why they're important is that the larvae are caterpillar-like and eat foliage and are plant feeders. So this is really important. Adults don't sting, so you don't have to worry about that unless you're a plant. They're called sawfly because they have a flat saw-like ovipositor, and they usually saw into the plant and lay their eggs. Some lay them on the actual plant itself. There's various groups, some on conifers, so some will strip the needles off of pines. Others are actually called wood wasps, so the larvae bore into wood later on. They kind of are white and grub-like. But many can do foliate, many can be found in large groups on the plant. And some are slug-like and they skeletonize the plant. So they look like they're kind of slimy looking. You wouldn't even know there was an insect. You'd think it was a worm or a slug, and they'll sit there and feed on the kind of the leaf. So how do you tell the difference between a sawfly larva and a caterpillar? This is actually one reason you have to, is that, for instance, BT, which is a really common organic it's made from bacteria toxins, does not affect sawflies. So you can spray them all day and it's not going to affect them. So we've actually had situations where people are like, oh, it's not working. It's like, well, because that's a sawfly, not a caterpillar. So, anybody want to tell me how to tell the difference? I don't expect you to. Okay, so here's the difference between sawflies and caterpillars. So caterpillars, what are caterpillars? Larvae of what? Butterflies and moths. So very common because they're also plant feeders as well. But you can see, almost look identical. But true caterpillars have 5 or fewer prolegs on their abdomen. These are these fleshy false legs that they use to grip onto plants. And they are tipped with little hooks called crochets. And if you ever get a caterpillar, look at it under a lens and you'll see those little hooks on the feet. In sawflies, they have 6 or more pairs of prolegs and they don't have those hooks on the end. If you can only see the head, a very good character is that the sawflies only have one lens on their, like an eye. Basically, it's very comical. It looks like somebody just stuck a googly eye. Whereas caterpillars typically have a few smaller eyes on their head. And also one other thing is that caterpillars will have at least the hairs on the body like this, if not more, like the really fuzzy caterpillars, whereas sawflies rarely have those hairs. There's one on roses that's bristly, but otherwise most of the time they don't have those. Now another group of wasps you'll be dealing with out there are the gall wasps. Now galls are these abnormal growths on plants. They're kind of like tumors caused by all different types of creatures, and we're going to talk about a lot of galls. I didn't even talk about the aphid galls that are out there on witch hazel and things like that. But these wasps, they don't sting people, but they do sting the trees, and they basically lay their eggs in the plant. 95% of them out there are going to be on oaks, and specific to a species of oak. A couple on roses and a couple other hosts, but for the most part, gall wasps are found on oaks. They can produce these very large, spectacular galls. So how many of you have ever seen this kind of big puffball on an oak? Like, yeah. So that they're white with pink spots. That's actually multiple little chambers of little baby wasps developing in there. And they actually alternate, a lot of these alternate their life cycle. So they'll have a really big showy gall that produces asexual generation, it's only females, and then they go out, they sting a plant, and the next generation is just a little twig swelling, and that produces males and females and stuff. So really complicated. In fact, does anybody know who Alfred Kinsey is, or was? So he was a famous sex researcher, a human sex researcher. What's that? Yeah. So he He actually started out his career studying gall wasps. That was his thing. He was a world expert on gall wasps, and then he moved over to human sexuality. They have really weird wasps have really weird sexual things where males come from unfertilized eggs and females come from mated eggs and stuff. So anyway, they don't really cause serious damage to trees. They may maybe make it look unsightly. They're also almost impossible to control. But people are gonna freak out about it. They see a lot of lumps on their branches, or they see these things. And often, if you know what species of oak you have, and then look at the type of gall, and there's a really good website called gallformers.org right now, where you can identify these galls to the species. And they have lots of good photos and things like that. So, yeah, yes.
Gall formers.
Yeah, gallformers.org. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it actually is all different types of insect galls. And actually, I think they even have fungal galls and things like that too. Because again, lots of things create galls. There are nematodes, like root knot nematode causes galls on the roots of plants. Fungi, bacteria, there's a lot of different organisms that cause these kind of, and one of the reasons is that those galls are more nutritious, they kind of shunt nutrients to that part of the plant. In fact, in the fall, you can sometimes see leaves on the ground that are brown except for the little green patches, and that's where a gall was, or a leaf miner or something where the insect has changed the physiology of the plant. Okay, now caterpillars. We just talked about what caterpillars are. So these are baby Lepidoptera. Now, most of them out there are gonna be moths, because the majority of Lepidoptera are moths. In fact, butterflies are technically just day flying moths. They evolved from them. But caterpillars are important because Lepidoptera in general, 95% of them, 99% of them feed on plants. There are a few that feed on other things, but most of the time they feed on plants, so that means that a lot of them can become pests. So, bagworms, everybody's favorite. How many of you all have seen bagworms? What have you seen it on?
Fruit trees.
What's that?
I've seen them on fruit trees.
Fruit trees, yeah. So the common one, they call it the evergreen bagworm, Thyrodopteryx ephemeroformis. Oh, I was gonna get you guys to pronounce that. Sorry, so that species does feed on a lot of different plants, but they are often found in conifers, especially arborvitae, things like that. You often see kind of these small plants stripped bare, and you have these bags hanging on it. Now, I'd like to talk about this as far as where we are in the season, because these only have one generation a year. So basically, at this time of year, you have bags on plants. Those bags are either empty because they had a male, and that's a moth with wings that comes out, or they're filled with a dead female, because they never leave the bag, and eggs. So those eggs are now waiting for May or June or so to start to warm up. Then they will crawl out of there, those little caterpillars, and make their own little tiny bags. Thing is that most people don't see those tiny caterpillars until it's too late, and they're huge caterpillars, and it's very difficult to control them. So definitely, if you have a plant that has infestation often, you want to get rid of those bags, because the bags contain hundreds of eggs that will turn into hundreds of caterpillars. And we had a section of plant come in one time that was about this big, and it had 30 little babies on it, and you would never know it because they're so tiny. But most people are more familiar with the big ones, and you can see they've made their bag out of, caterpillars produce silk. They produce it from a little gland on their mouth parts, and they will grab debris from the environment. I've even seen them grabbing the tests, the coverings from armored scales and things like that, and just throwing them on their bag, because they're camouflaging in the area. And so they feed on a lot of different things. This one's on cherry laurel, so it's not just on conifers. But what you want to do is, if they're small and you catch them at the right time, you can use chemical control and things like that, and that'll kill them. But most of the time, they're either protected by the bag or too big or whatnot. At this time of year, what you want to do is go search your plants, and if you have bagworm infestations, you're going to look for these bags, and then what are you going to do with them?
Take them off
How are you going to take them off?
with a glove.
With a glove? Sure, you can. But the problem is, you don't want to leave this little silk tie off here. So they tie that off. The silk is much stronger than the plant. And so what it'll do is it'll girdle that branch. So what you want to do is take a little razor and cut that, and then unwrap it if you can. We have seen plants come in where the tips are starting to brown, and you can find there's a little kind of almost like a gall forming because the liquids are not going the right way because they're strangled by that little silk tie off. Fall cankerworms are another group. These are technically inchworms, and the inchworms, these little green inchworms, you can actually, how many pro legs do you see on there? Remember I was talking about those false legs?
3?
2.
So this is a kind of a trick question. So it's got these two large ones, but to identify this inchworm from other inchworms, which usually only have the two pairs, these actually have a little stubby pair right here. And so that's how you can identify fall cankerworm from other inchworms like that. We haven't had many outbreaks of these, but when we do, they kind of defoliate plants in the spring when they're just leafing out. Now, why is it called the fall cankerworm if they come out in the spring? There is a spring cankerworm too, but yeah.
They fall from the plant.
That's a good rationale. They do fall from the plant and they'll hang from strings, but that's actually not why they're called that. They're called that because the adults are active in the fall and the winter. And so that's actually an adult female. What do you notice about it? That's a moth. What do you notice about it? No wings. So there are several moths that don't have wings, and these lack wings completely, the females. The males have wings, they'll fly and mate with the females. So the females crawl up the trees. So what happens is in spring, the caterpillars are munching, they go drop to the ground, develop in the ground, they come off as adults in the fall, the females crawl up the trees and mate with males, lay their eggs, and then again the cycle happens. So some people ban their trees to keep the females from crawling up, they get stuck in there because they can't fly. But we haven't had many outbreaks of these recently. Some things you might see in the summer are these large caterpillars called the prominents. These turn into a brown moth, leaf-like moth. But these are typically hairy and striped, really brightly colored. That's actually two species on a plant. And they'll sometimes feed in groups, or they'll rear up and they'll kind of spit out, not spit out, but like kind of froth the mouth with nasty stuff. And they're brightly colored and all this stuff because they don't want birds to eat them. They also don't want you to eat them, so don't do that. But they're young. When they're young, they often are in groups, skeletonized leaves, but then as they get older, they can strip leaves off the plants, and there's a bunch of different species out feeding on different types of plants. Now, Diatana major, below, the really pretty one with the yellow spots on it, is called the azalea prominent. And that's a different species, Ministra. But these are on a wild vaccinium. Does anybody know what vaccinium is?
Blueberry.
Blueberry, so wild blueberry. So why is the azalea prominent on a blueberry?
Because they're all in the same family, the Ericaceae family.
So they're very close relatives. So this is also just to signify that oftentimes you don't think, oh, okay, this can get on that. It's, they seem very different because the plants are related, the insects smell them, they smell similar and stuff like that. Just because they look different doesn't mean that you're not going to get a certain pest on them. So basically that's an interesting thing. So you often see them when they're crawling down the trees to go pupate. These also have one generation a year. They're very common in the summer. Another similar looking group are the oak worms. So these only feed on oaks. They're, again, fairly large. Both these types of groups have about 2-inch long caterpillars. I mean, they're pretty decent sized caterpillars. The oak worms are thinner stripes. They have all these kind of spikes on them, and almost like these are fake antennae almost. They're actually protrusions out of the thorax. But they typically strip the leaves of oaks in the summer, again, one generation a year. We find that these insects are native of this and the other group, and they don't kill the plants. Stripping the leaves off of a few really healthy plants is not going to harm them, especially in the summer. But I think people complain most about these is they create large pellets, frass pellets, these poop, and they basically rain down from the oaks. And so sometimes they rain down on surfaces that we don't want them on. They become slippery and gross in wetness, and so you don't want to slip on caterpillar poo and fall into it and all that stuff. So this is why people don't like them that much. But again, they're not going to kill your oak tree that's out there. They're gonna, they've evolved together. They're going to be fine. Now, two groups of caterpillars that produce these silken tents, or kind of yes.
Instead of getting rid of these caterpillars, aren't they sustaining food for birds?
They are. I mean, I don't know. It really depends because they are brightly colored. They try and warn that they're not maybe tasty, but there are definitely plenty of things that eat them. And I would say for most of these caterpillars, unless your tree is getting attacked year after year and getting stripped, usually they're only abundant in one time a year, and the trees, especially late summer, stuff like that, the trees have done a lot of their nutrient, collection, things like that. So foliar feeders are typically not a big issue. It's the same with diseases. Leaf spots are typically not a big issue. They're not going to harm the actual plant. So these things they can be a nuisance or whatever, but unless you can reach that branch or things like that, it's probably just best to leave them. And after a few weeks, they're gone. They've got to go down to the ground, pupate. And those are actually, the oak worms are actually relatives of Luna moths. So their adults they're these kind of medium-sized orange moths. They're really pretty. So, again, they're native. They're not going to kill your tree or anything. So, yeah.
Is the frass beneficial for the tree?
Yeah, I'm sure it has. Yeah, so I'm sure when it decays and stuff like that, it's got nutrients and everything in there. Yeah, so yeah, it's but when it gets on surfaces that people don't like, the porch or the driveway, they don't really like it. It's gross. I mean, So now these two caterpillars some people confuse them because they'll call both a webworm or a tent caterpillar. Some people actually call these bagworms because they do create those silken bags on plants. But they are very different. So the fall webworm here, both have one generation a year. Fall webworm comes out in the summer and to fall. They have a very long CD on them. The longest CD are about half the body length. They do come in a couple of different color forms. And they're about an inch long. About 2 inches long are the tent caterpillars. They're very fuzzy. They've got this white stripe down the back. And the tent caterpillars are spring active. So late spring, sometimes early summer, but usually around May, late April, early May or so. These create the webbing at the tips of the trees. These create webbing at the crotch of the tree. These are typically going to be found on rosaceous hosts like cherries and apples and things like that, whereas these feed on a lot of different types of plants. I would say these are much more significant and much more noticeable. In fact, when you're driving down the highway in the summer and you see all those webs in the trees and stuff, that's what's causing them. Now, some things you can do, if they're in the tent, chemicals won't reach them, so you can break it open with a pole trimmer or something like that. That'll allow things to come in to eat them. You can also treat the vegetation near them because they're going to crawl out from there and feed on that vegetation. And so when you see them, so this is the fall webworm. Again, they look terrible, but these trees have survived getting fed on them by, for millions of years and stuff like that. Here's the tent caterpillars you can see on that crotch. And actually, if you ever notice, especially on rosaceous hosts, these little foamy egg masses wrapping around the twigs, that's actually the eggs of the eastern tent caterpillar. Now, one I added, if anybody saw this talk before, this wasn't here, but fall armyworms. How many of you all had to deal with fall armyworms last year? So, this is a caterpillar. It's not a worm. They call a lot of caterpillars worms, obviously. They can't overwinter in North Carolina, so they come up from the Gulf states, especially Florida, where they can overwinter. So that means they're often dependent on the severity each year is dependent often on weather systems and how well they get up here. So especially when storms, we had some storms right in the summer, they blew up those moths up here, they come here and they're like, oh cool, there's stuff for us to eat. So they lay their eggs then on different surfaces, sometimes on buildings, sometimes on bushes around. They don't feed on those because they only feed on grasses and in agricultural systems, corn, which is just a big grass. They can consume large areas of turf very quickly, and they can be difficult to detect at first. So one common thing to use is soap flushes, or if you see birds pecking at your lawn, go and investigate, collect whatever's there. This can then reveal these little tiny larvae, which are much easier to control when they're small, rather than when they get big. And so the way to identify this caterpillar is that it has this inverted Y, yellow Y on its head, and also it has these large black warts on its rump that are bigger than the breathing hole right here. So those are kind of the ways to tell that. But they do come in different color forms, not just green, sometimes more browner, sometimes more green. So yeah, that's fall armyworm. And then probably one of the most important groups of caterpillars are the borers. So again, all these other ones, now fall armyworm will kind of decimate your lawn because they're going to just chew it down to the ground. If you've got a healthy lawn, it'll come back, all that stuff, and you can do things. These borers bore into the plant and actually can kill the plants. Especially everybody's favorite, the squash vine borer, one of the few that feeds on herbaceous hosts. So they love to bore into the base of cucumber or pumpkins, cucumbers, watermelons, stuff like that, and they just sit in there, poop and eat and kill the plant. And then the plant melts, and then they're happy and they emerge and they're happy. So the larvae are white and grub-like. Why aren't they green like other caterpillars? They don't need to be. They're not on leaf. They're inside the plant. And so they may bore into trees and shrubs. You may see sap. If you have peach trees that have borers in them, you'll have gummosis coming out of them. And the adults are very beautiful day-flying moths that mimic wasps. And so some look identical to a yellow jacket, for instance. The raspberry crown borer, for instance, is a beautiful moth. But they are destructive, of course. Okay, quickly a few more. So moving from caterpillars to thrips. So thrips, if you want to kill an entomologist, you say thrip. It hurts me to say that. But thrips is both singular and plural, so don't ever say thrip. These are very small insects, only a couple millimeters long typically, with these strap-like wings with hairs on them. There are various groups. These are some of the darker ones, but I'll show you the more typical ones next. But these feed on plants, although some are predators, some are actually beneficial predators. Others feed on fungi. But some groups actually transmit diseases like tomato spotted wilt virus. So if anybody ever had that in their garden, it's a really severe virus, not of just tomatoes, but of a lot of different plants. Now, the common thrips are going to be in this group, the Frankliniella. So they kind of look lizard-like, I think. They're like these little tiny things. If you're not sure if you have thrips, they often are in flowers too. You can take a plant sample and kind of beat it on a piece of white paper and look for these little tiny things that are kind of scuttling around. That's usually thrips. Here's a thrips larva. Again, this is a group where they do have a resting stage in the adult. But you can tell thrips damage often on leaves because they suck the green out of it. They turn silver and patches of white. And they're also really messy. They like to poop where they're eating. So all these little specks right here are just fecal matter that they pooped out. Very common group of insects that feed on plants. Okay, beetles. What is a beetle? Anybody know what defines beetles?
Colopteria.
Yep. So that's the order.
It has chewing parts.
What's that? Chewing part? They do have chewing mouth parts.
The wings have specific, like there's the top and the bottom wing, the wings are defined.
Kind of, yeah.
Like a sheath,
Yeah, that's it.
leathery something.
Yep. So Coleoptera, the order means sheath wing. And so basically their front wings are hardened and leathery or really hard and crunchy. They're really crunchy insects. And what they do is they open up those front wings, and then behind them are these membranous hind wings that can fly, use to fly. This is why they're really successful. They can invade all different environments like rotten wood and water and things like that, aquatic environments, things like that. But you'll recognize a lot of them. So first are the scarab beetles. So everybody's favorite up there, Japanese beetle. So, but there are a lot of really important scarab beetles. So scarab beetles are characterized by the adults have their antennae kind of have regular segments, and then at the tip they have these kind of segments that open and close like that, and that's how they smell. That's actually, if you didn't know, that's how insects they used to smell. The antennae, they're not feelers like a lot of people think, but they actually have chemosensors on them so they can smell things. Some groups, it's the larvae that are most important. They're the white grubs, the C-shaped white grubs that you often find in soil. Now, if you are digging around in your garden or around in your yard and you find one, don't freak out. That doesn't mean that it's going to kill everything around. Many of them are also feeding on decaying matter or in rotten wood, things like that. And a lot of them turn out to be beautiful things like rhinoceros beetles and these really amazing kind of insects. So just because you have white grubs doesn't mean they're doing necessarily damage, but sometimes when you find them in turf, and they're basically eating all the roots, it's dead, and you see a lot of birds, or you can pull up the turf very easily. So that's when you kind of know you have a problem. But some adults do feed on foliage, like the Japanese beetles. They're often on grapes and roses, things like that, and they kind of chew the leaves into this lacy look, and they're just everywhere. Now, I think they're beautiful, but they are kind of destructive, obviously. But there are a lot of really important ones too, like dung scarabs. So like dung beetles are a scarab beetle, and they help remove that dung waste, bury it in the ground, and it has a lot of benefits, obviously, because you don't have to walk through poo all day long. So.
Is it worth identifying, or trying to differentiate between different types of grubs? Or is it really hard to kind of get a good idea?
It depends. Some, when you're digging in the ground, you're going to find lots of different larvae of different creatures, of different arthropods. Some are going to actually be beneficial predators, Others are going to be just kind of there eating decaying stuff. Others are going to be actually feeding on the plant. So it can help to know which one is which. And people dig up something and say, oh, this is on my garden. Is this killing my plants? And it turns out to be something that's a predator or whatever. And we can easily then say, no, this wouldn't be killing your plants and stuff. So, okay, leaf beetles are a really diverse group of beetles. You can see these two are both leaf beetles, but they look very different. You've got the tortoise beetle and a striped cucumber beetle. Most of them, almost all of them feed on plants as adults and larvae. Some, again, the adults are the pest, some the larvae are the pest, others both. And many of the larvae are found in the ground and are worm-like, but other groups like Colorado potato beetle and a few others, the larvae are actually on the plant feeding on the foliage. Some do transmit diseases, like this one transmits bacterial wilt to cucurbits because it feeds on the bacteria-laden kind of tissue, then it flies to another plant, starts feeding on that, it poops, and that bacteria then gets in the plant and kills it. So they can be important. Super diverse though, on just about every plant you might find a species of leaf beetle, and here's just some of the diversity you can see there. So this is a leaf mining one, so the larvae actually live in the leaf. This is the red-headed flea beetle, here feeding on rosemary, and flea beetles are a type of leaf beetle that have these large hind legs and they jump. And these are a really common nursery pest right now. This one feeds on oaks. This is the imported willow leaf beetle. And so this is one where the adults, this really beautiful little tiny blue beetle, and those little caterpillar-like larvae are both pests of the willows.
What is the one beside it?
This one, the brown one? Yeah, so that's an oak leaf beetle. This one is really cool because they actually tuck their heads and legs in their body and they look like caterpillar poo. That's how they camouflage. So. But yeah, so you can see, and actually these look a lot like caterpillars, but if you look, they don't have any prolegs, and so yeah. Now longhorn beetles are a related group, and you can see they have a really long antennae. That's the characteristic of this group. These are ones that are often blamed. This is where I'm going to get on my high horse or whatever, and say, basically, oftentimes when you see holes in plants or something boring into a woody plant or a tree, people want to jump to, oh, these beetles killed my tree. So that is almost never the case. Oftentimes, these insects are coming in because they need plants that are dead or dying to invade because they can't invade healthy plants. And so these lay their eggs on the plants, their grub-like larvae bore into the plant or under the bark. And so people will find this dead limb and they'll say, oh, there's these larvae in it, they killed the plant. So let me ask you this. How do you know when a plant is sick or dying or just not very happy or stressed? If anybody asks them and they respond, I'd be very curious, but yeah.
If it drops its leaves, like
Okay,
mass
if it
drop of leaves.
drops the leaves, what else?
It doesn't fruit.
Doesn't fruit, what else?
Look at the color.
The color can be, what else, anything?
It wilts.
It wilts? Okay, how did you tell that? How were you able to tell that that was happening? You look with your eyes. Have you ever smelled a plant to see if it was sick?
Oh, the bugs.
Can you smell a plant to see if it's sick? No. These beetles can smell a plant when it's sick before it even looks sick. So that's the thing. So they come in before you even think it's unhealthy. That plant is green, but it's really screaming out with chemicals that it's stressed or dying. And these beetles want to be there first because they want to have their babies have the best environment. So just because something is invading a plant does not mean it's killing the plant or the cause. Now there are the Asian longhorn beetle, which is a really beautiful big black with white spot beetle. There's actually an outbreak in Charleston, South Carolina right now. That will attack live maples, no problem. It'll bore into them, make pencil-sized holes in it, and can kill them eventually. So it's a huge pest. There's efforts to eradicate it. They've already eradicated from other areas. But for the most part, these do this. There are actually species also that will girdle plants. They'll kind of cut them off to kill the plant so that they can have that dead plant material. So they can't even eat the live plant, even if they wanted to. So longhorn beetles are often blamed, but they're not actually the cause typically. Unless you know specifically that you have Asian longhorn beetle or something that has girdled it or something like that. Yes?
Is there, I know you're saying you can't smell them like with our nose, but is there like a scientific test way to like smell a plant?
People were trying to develop artificial noses before and stuff like that. One of the things they actually produce is ethanol. So if you ever see insects flying around a beer or wine that you have, that's because they've evolved to find ethanol because that's a decay byproduct and it's a way for them to know. But yeah, they don't have that yet. So, So make the plants happy and you won't have these borers. If the plant starts to die or a limb starts to die, they're going to come in because they're the first decomposers. Actually, it's really important. If they weren't for these things getting in there into the wood out in the forest and everything, the plants wouldn't decay, the wood wouldn't decay, things like that. Can I go till 9:30 then? Oh, 10:30 actually?
you
Yeah.
have till
Okay, good.
10:30,
Okay, so another closely related group are the weevils. This is a huge group of insects. In fact, it's one of the largest families of animals on Earth. There are over 60,000 species on Earth. You know how many species of mammals? So we're one species of mammal. How many species of mammals are there on Earth?
10,000.
10,000? It's about 6,000 or 7,000. There's 10 times as many weevils as there are all mammals on Earth. So super diverse, really important group. They typically have a rostrum. This one's got a short, blunt one, but they often have a long nose, kind of, and they have these elbowed antennae. The larvae are grub-like and always lack legs. So they don't have the true thoracic legs that the lots of larvae have. Like the leaf beetles will have these kind of gripping legs. They won't have those pro legs. These don't have anything on them. Now, most of the time they're in the soil and they're white, or they're in a host boring into it, or in a fruit like plum curculio, things like that. But some like this vegetable weevil will actually live on the foliage and feed, and they look like little legless caterpillars, basically. Almost all are plant feeders, and sometimes the adults actually feed on the plants. So these two-banded Japanese weevils will come out at night and chew notches in the plants. And so, and some are stored product pests as well in the home. So they'll often feed, the adults will often feed it from the edges, and larvae are found in the soil or in the plant, things like that.
Sorry.
Yes?
Stored product pests?
Yes, so in your house, they can be one of the groups that, there's some weevils that feed on kind of corn and rice and things like that that are in the house. So so if you see a little beetle in the house, it's got a little snout, that's going to be Psittophilis probably. It's a really common genus of stored product pests. Many of these other groups, you don't have them that kind of cross over between stored product and like live plants, but weevils are just so diverse. And in fact, they're so diverse that some people don't even realize that they're not all called weevils, because bark and ambrosia beetles, which you may have heard of, are technically a type of weevil. Yes?
So you talked about the stored product pests. Those, are they usually coming in like with the food when you buy it, or are they in your house and getting into the container? It
Depends. Most of the time it's coming with the food, but depending on what's flying around and your storage and stuff like that, if there's, they can come in and lay eggs and things like that in there. But oftentimes we find that they come in with the product. But yeah, it's hard to tell where it came from oftentimes, but luckily cleaning it up and all that stuff really helps, and that kind of contains them. So bark and ambrosia beetles, I get a lot of calls, oh, the ambrosia beetles killed my tree. The same exact thing. These things they've even done experiments where they have these beetles where they put them in cages next to trees and kind of keep them there, and then they've overwatered the one plant and then left the other one. The overwatered plant is stressed and the beetle will bore right into it. The other one won't even pay attention to the plant. So again, they typically need plants that are unhealthy. There are, again, a few exceptions to this. Did you have a question about that? Yeah.
Also, not only just overwatering, but like when we have a bad drought, right?
Yep. Any stress, when plants get stressed, they get more susceptible to pests because they can't fight them off and all that stuff. Or they're more attractive because these pests are taking advantage of that stress. And they'll just push them over the edge. So even though they don't directly kill it, they will contribute to the death of the plant because they're just pushing it over the edge and making it more stressed, basically. So keeping happy plants is really important. Making sure they're planted in the right spot, they're watered enough, or not too much, or things like that. And this group is very tiny. Most of them are very small and pill-shaped. In fact, this right here, I don't know if you can see, that's a fingernail there, because there's a little tiny twig, and there's a little tiny colony of these black twig borers in there. So these beetles, again, they're weevils, even though they don't look like it. Up until when I learned them, they were a separate group. They were considered a separate group, but they're actually now considered true weevils. The bark beetles typically feed underneath the bark in that nutritious layer. And if you break off the bark of a plant, for instance, like a branch that's dead, and you see that weird little design, like a nice little kind of design in there, that's often bark beetles. Ambrosia beetles are not wood feeders or plant feeders, but they're gardeners like you. So they grow fungi in those tunnels. So what they do is they bore straight into the wood, and you often have these frass toothpicks of sawdust coming out, and they bore straight into the wood and make galleries in there, and what they do is they actually carry a little pocket, in their pockets on their body, they have spores of fungi, and they seed the inside those tunnels, and then the fungus grows out, and then the larvae and the adults feed on the fungus. This is why they can't actually feed in live plants and healthy plants, because the fungus can't grow in those. Fun fact, there's actually one group of ambrosia beetles that they don't even bring their own fungus, they just burrow right next door, and then the fungus from their neighbors grows into their tunnel. They're really interesting. In fact, many of the ambrosia beetles are haplodiploid, just like the wasps. So the females can produce young that are males or females. And basically, that little tiny one's the male, the brother, and it mates with his sisters, and then they go out and infest a new tree, and then he just dies. He stays in there his whole life. Yes?
In summary, then, these burrowing beetles, they're a sign of the plant that's just so stressed.
For the most part. So there are exceptions to all these things. So, for instance, red bay ambrosia beetle is a non-native species that came in. It brought a fungus that's really bad for bay laurels, sassafras, avocado, anything in the lauraceae. And they are attracted to healthy plants and will bore right into them. And when they seed it with the fungus, that fungus clogs the vascular system, you get wilt and then death. So that is one we have to, in fact, we get in samples of that where Mike identifies the fungus, but recently was the first time I had ever gotten an actual beetle. Oftentimes you'll actually have the secondary cousins coming in as well. What's really another fun fact is that they'll even bore into gas cans and things like that, because they're confused. They think it's like a dead plant, and they'll bore into that plastic gas can and stuff. So they don't know what they're doing. They're just smelling stuff, and they're just gonna bore right in. The other bark beetle that can be a problem, that has had outbreaks, is the southern pine beetle. Now that's not an ambrosia beetle, but the larvae, that is another one that attacks pines that are healthy. They overwhelm the plant. Basically, the resin that pines produce, that really sticky stuff, is meant for insect control. What it does is pushes the beetles out of the plant when they bore in. But those, that's often people say, oh, pine beetles will kill my pine. We rarely have outbreaks here in North Carolina, and when you do, we know about it. They just haven't happened very often. So most of the time, again, that pine is unhealthy. There's something happening with it, and so I would assume it is, unless you know the specifics, like it's a bay, like a lauracean host, and you see the fungal streaks and things like that. So yeah, really interesting group though of beetles. Okay. Home stretch, a couple more things. So let's talk about a couple flies. Now, flies are one of my favorite groups of insects that I've studied. They are super weird. They're also the most annoying to a lot of people. Anybody know what distinguishes a fly, a true fly, so dragonfly is not a true fly, butterfly is not a true fly, a housefly is a true fly. And actually, when we write that, whenever you see a common name written out, if it's one word, it's not a true fly or true bug or whatever. Like a ladybug is a beetle, not a true bug. And we all know what true bugs are, right?
Two wings?
Yeah. So flies, yes. So flies have only two true wings. The hind wings are reduced in these little drumstick-like organs called hawk ears that help them balance when they're flying. Flies are super diverse. They're the most ecologically diverse of all groups of insects. In fact, there's the largest animal that lives its entire life on the surface of Antarctica is a fly. It's a little tiny 6 millimeter long fly. Penguins go back to the sea, all this stuff, whatever, but they actually stay on land. But flies are really kind of hardcore in a lot of ways. There's some really important pests, but a lot of beneficials as well. So I'm just going to talk about two flies that you might see out there. This is the second boxwood pest. This is the boxwood leaf miner. This is probably the second most common boxwood pest I see. This is a type of gall midge. Now these, as the name implies, what do they do often? They make galls. So yeah, so it is a type of gall midge. It's weird that it's called a leaf miner because this kind of technically makes a little gall, but it's really mining in the leaf. But leaf miners are basically insects that live in between the upper and lower surface of the leaf, and they feed in there, and they're really protected. The gall midges are super diverse. In fact, we think that this family of insects contains over 1 million species at least. I would not be surprised at all. And almost every plant out there has at least a couple species that feed on it. But the one I'm going to talk about today specifically is the boxwood leaf miner. It creates these little blister-like galls, the larvae. They're kind of like, and because the boxwood has this kind of hollow leaf, they call them leaf miners. But there's these little maggots in there. So now, One thing about fly larvae is that they never have true legs as well. So many are maggot-like and have no head, no legs. They're really worm-like and just kind of squirm around. Others, like mosquito larvae, are much more mobile and stuff, but they also never have true legs. But these, the female will lay, you see a little sharp ovipositor there. When the new growth comes out, you'll often see these orange swarming gnats around your boxwoods. They look like little mosquitoes, and in fact mosquitoes are flies too. And they come around and they sting the plant and lay their eggs in there, and that's where the larvae develop. So I would say in about a month or so, when it starts getting warm, the boxwoods start to produce. If you have an infestation of them, take a look. You're gonna see these little, like a cloud of little orange flies around them, and they're gonna lay their eggs in there. Now they don't harm the plant. They won't kill the plant, but they just make it look bad with those blisters on them. Now a completely different group of flies, more of a fly-like fly rather than like a kind of midge-like fly, there's a whole group of flies called leaf miner flies in the family Agromyzidae, and they look more like a little tiny house fly or something like that. But this is the daylily leaf miner. So this has only been in the US for, well now like, 14 years or so. Only attacks daylily, and what they do is they puncture the leaf, the females will puncture the leaf with their ovipositor, they'll feed on a little bit of sap, and then they lay their egg in there, and the maggot crawls up and down in the leaf and creates these little silver streaks in there. They don't affect the flowers. They're very difficult to control, but just be aware of them out there, because if somebody says, oh, what are all these silver streaks on my daylilies? It's these little flies. And if in the warm periods of the year, you go out there and look at these patches of daylilies, you'll see these little tiny black flies landing on it and kind of hanging out. Now, note that there's a lot of different other flies that are on vegetation, and many of them are predators or beneficials, so flies, again, are really diverse. You really have to know which flies are the culprit versus the kind of beneficial or whatever. And yeah, actually, I'm gonna have to add that soon. We just have anybody know of a new leaf miner fly that's really important? It just arrived in North Carolina in 2023. So that is not a true fly. That is actually a bug, the lanternfly. So that's why it's really confusing, is that fly has been used in a lot of different insect names. So spotted lanternfly is a bug, is a hopper related to the aphids and things like that, actually. So it's a sucking insect. So, but this is a true fly. So the allium leaf miner is what it is. So it feeds on leeks, onions, garlic. It mines up and down, and it will then mine into the base. It causes damage to the plant. The plant doesn't develop well, and so it's going to become pretty serious. So if you try and grow garlic or onions, it's going to be a big, serious pest right now. And that's only been in the U.S. since 2015, up in Pennsylvania. So this is why we also are, at the lab and everything, are always looking out for these things, because there may be a chance that we're the first to see it and it can be eradicated, which has happened with a few things. But if nobody notices it and then the word doesn't get out, these can spread, and then like the spotted lanternfly, it is here to stay. It's never going to go, and this fly is never going to go either. There's no way to eradicate it now. So we just got to live with it.
What do you mean when you say it makes it unthrifty?
It just makes it look bad. Yeah, unthrifty is a weird way. I don't know. It's an old way for people to say it just looks bad. Okay, finally, mites. One of my favorite groups of organisms, one of my favorite groups of arthropods. What am I not saying?
It's not an insect.
It's not an insect, yeah. So these, what are they though? Yep, arachnids. So related to spiders and scorpions, things like that. Mites are the only group of arachnids that feed on plants. Not all of them feed on plants, and in fact mites are also probably one of the biggest group of organisms on Earth, one of the most diverse. What blew my mind once was reading that there are mites that live 5,000 meters down in the bottom of the ocean, in the sediment there, and there are mites that live in the noses of seals and sea lions and things like that, and there are mites that live in the noses of hummingbirds and in our faces. Did you know you have mites in your face? So we all have that stuff, so we're very intimately associated with mites. Super diverse, mostly very tiny, but some are really important plant pests. So the first group are the spider mites. So spider mites are called that because they do produce silk. We left this apple plant in our lab over the weekend. They really like dry conditions. It was very dry, and you can see they exploded and they spun all this silk all over the plant, and we're kind of crawling in between it and stuff. Very tiny little mites. These are less than a millimeter long. They're half a millimeter long or so. And this is the two-spotted spider mite. Those are the two spots. And here's a pair of them. This is the male and the female, having a lovely lunch, I guess, together. Spider mites are really important plant pests, and they cause stippling damage typically. So the boxwood spider mite is the most common boxwood pest out there. You rarely ever see the mites. They're cool season mite. So in the summer, when most people are out there seeing the damage, the mites are not around. The eggs are hanging out and waiting to hatch when it's cooler. But all these yellow stipples on the leaves are going to be a sign that you have boxwood spider mite. The eggs can be distinct, and they do have many generations per year. So spider mites are really common. There's some that have broad host ranges, like the two-spotted spider mite gets on so many different types of plants. Others, like the boxwood mite, are only found on that type of plant. Now, there are other things called false spider mites or flat mites. It looks like a spider mite that somebody stepped on and it survived. And they produce very similar damage, and are actually close relatives. But one really, really important mite are broad mites. Not related and about half the size of a spider mite. But these mites crawl around plants. They feed on the new growth. And if you can see them close enough, they're very easy to recognize. This is a male, so this is not one to really recognize. But what you want to recognize is the eggs. So if you can actually see the eggs, the females are football shaped, kind of fast, moving around. And they lay these that's how big the egg is compared to the female. So they lay these very characteristic knobby, they almost look like crystal balls eggs. There's no other mite that produces eggs like that, so it's really easy to find. Now, the way to really know that you have them, or at least what happens is why people try to find them, is that they cause this really characteristic damage where they cause the new growth to be distorted and leathery or strappy or whatever. That's because they can only feed on new growth, the tender new growth, and when their saliva gets into the plant, it causes these issues where it's basically toxic to the plant. So I was asked, what is this plant right here?
Are they one of the causes of fasciation then? Or is it's different?
Yeah, so fasciation is actually a genetic thing typically.
Oh.
So it's and that's where you get these strap-like stems or really kind of strange doubling of things, or like flower heads where they're doubled and stuff. So that's a genetic thing as far as I know. So yeah, but this is one reason also. There are herbicides that can cause this look. There are viruses that can cause this look. This is why we need to diagnose whether you have mites that you can spray, whether it's a virus that the plant's going to have forever, or if it's herbicide and it was your fault. So so basically, what plant is this? Anybody know? It looks like a dogwood. It doesn't really look like any kind of plant, huh?
Is it a hellebore?
Nope, that's a hydrangea. So they cause the leaves to be really strap-like and gross looking like that. So if you see that, we're gonna look for those little tiny, if it comes to the lab, they're gonna send it to me first to look for the mites, because that's the easiest diagnosis, because once I see them, it's like, okay, it's got broad mites. That's it, we'll stop there. So yeah, that's one of my favorite things to ask.
Each of those clusters is one egg.
That's one egg with little knobs on it, yeah. So that's an egg, that's an egg, that's an egg. And so yeah, now there is a close relative called the cyclamen mite. It's really common. The strawberry growers are really worried about it because it does cause damage to them. That has a smooth egg, and in fact, this family of mites is really diverse. So there are some that are associated with pine beetles, and the fungus that are in pine beetles. The bee tracheal mite, which actually these mites live in the breathing tubes of honeybees, is actually a disease of bees. There's some that lots of them feed on fungus, and we get them in the lab, and I have to say, okay, this is a fungus feeding one, it is not causing the issue. So they're a really diverse group of mites. And mites, again, are really diverse, and because they're so small and people don't pay attention to them much. I love them, I love mites. And then my favorite family of mites, or favorite group of mites, is the Eriophyid mites. These are tiny, tiny mites. These can rest on the leg of a spider mite. So these are 1/4 millimeter long. So you will not be able to see them with your eye, and you can see that. These are the stomates of the plants. So those are the breathing holes in the leaf, and that's how big those things are. These mites are worm-like, or they almost look like ice cream cones or bananas or something like that, and they only have 4 legs. How many legs would a typical mite have? 8, most of the time. So actually mites, when they're born, typically only have 6. And in fact, ticks are just big blood-feeding mites too, and they have 6 when they're larvae. Then a nymph has 8, and the adult has 8. But this group always only has 4. They don't have any use for their hind or middle legs. They just worm around, and they're actually surprisingly fast sometimes. But this group of mites is super diverse, all plant feeders, and have different lifestyles. So some are called vagrants. They just kind of walk around on the leaf feeding. You would never know they were there. Others are gall forming, where they'll create these galls where you cut it open and you look inside. So for instance, if you ever see poison ivy and it's got all these warts all over it, that's actually little colonies of these mites living inside. And I love that because the poison ivy gets its own little blisters and everything from these mites. But, and actually some of them transmit viruses. So for instance, rose rosette disease, rose rosette virus. Has anybody experienced that or seen that out there? So that is transmitted by these mites, and these mites are so tiny that they get blown around and splashed around, and they can spread very easily to close by plants. And in fact, when they get in high populations, they actually rear up on their they have little sticky stuff that comes out of their butt, and they rear up like this so that the wind can blow them to other plants and stuff. So my favorite thing to ask, so first of all, I guess that's a leaf from a tree. Does anybody know what tree that is? Oh. Do you have a question first? You can think about that first.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
How do you differentiate rosette from new growth?
So there's a couple different characteristics of rose rosette from new growth. So, well, wait long enough, and if it's still strappy and red, then it's probably rose rosette. So it should grow out of that red, new growth phase and expand. The other characteristics for rose rosette are typically that the branches, the new branches are thicker than the older branches, which is obviously really strange, and they're typically really thorny. So if you see like witch's broom or like really strappy red leaves, lots of thorns, really thick new growth branches, those are good signs that you've got rose rosette disease.
And how do you do? Just throw all of them out?
Destroy them, yeah. So viruses are systemic, so they live in the plant forever, and you can't cure them of it. Some people have talked about if you catch it in one part of the plant early enough and prune out that to the base of the plant, you might be able to save the plant. It's probably not worth it. I think there are probably some resistant varieties out there too, but basically making sure if you can reduce the source of more virus and mites, then, so get those sick plants out as quickly as possible. You hopefully will not have infection in the other plants. Or you can wait a little bit. They shouldn't survive for so long in the environment, the mites, and you can replant some roses and everything, but they're very common. So you see them in large plantings, you usually see it spreading, or really common in those where they're touching. Yeah, unfortunately that's the case though. That's why it's important to, make sure that these things don't get around and come into the country or whatever. So anyways, you guys have a guess on what that is? It's not a common tree, but it's the one I like. It actually has another species of mite that gets on it that causes kind of pustules on the top of the leaf, but this one is actually causing those edges, those little crinkles in the edges, and inside those crinkles are mites. So that's a black gum, Nyssa. So has a perfectly regular leaf normally, but you can see the mites have caused that crinkling on the edges. And my favorite thing to ask people is, what is this plant?
Swiss chard.
Yep, that's the most common answer.
Gotcha.
That's a poplar. The tree, poplar tree? So these mites, you can see all the little tiny yellow things on there in the zoomed in picture. Those are the mites crawling on it. And their saliva is basically toxic. And when they feed on the new growth, it doesn't expand correctly, and you get this wrinkliness and stuff. So you would not even know that was from a tree. So area 5 mites are super common. But I love them because they're very understudied. Many of them don't cause issues in the plants. In fact, I went around campus and collected the leaves, and you'd find the mites on the leaves. They're not causing any harm. You wouldn't even know they were there. And I sent them off to an expert, and of the 5 ones I sent off, 4 were new species, and 1 was a new life stage. So it's undescribed. And we described a new species, me and an expert, on hazelnuts from North Carolina recently. So really understudied, really diverse, but unless they're causing problems, nobody pays attention to them because they're little tiny things that you would never see. And there's some really amazing ones if you want to see in a minute. But that's it. That's all I have. In fact, I'll bring up some of the amazing ones if you want to see real quick because they're really cool. But yeah, any questions? So, yes.
Are there ways natural ways you can prevent some of those in the garden?
So, yeah, it really depends on what you're really trying to prevent.
All of them. I don't know you better.
Well, it really, yeah, there's no general rule for anything, honestly, out there. Preventing things, well, the first step is making healthy plants, like keeping plants healthy. That's gonna be, trees out in a parking lot in the middle of the, are unhappy, and that's why you see the most pests and everything like that. If you plant it where it wants to be, it's gonna be happy. If it's native and it really only has native pests, it's going to either have them anyway, and you really don't want completely sterile yard that has no feeding, because all the cool butterflies that people love, they're eating your plants too and stuff like that. So you really, you don't want to do that, because you want to also provide habitat for the native things and stuff, and they're going to eat your plants. That just is what happened. The plants are fine, and you worry more about your plants than the plants worry about themselves like that. It's like getting a haircut or whatever. It's getting some leaves eaten is not going to really harm them, and they've evolved with these things. So that is one thing too, is assuming that you can just destroy everything and control everything, and that every plant's going to be perfect looking, because you don't even want that. That's not, it's kind of artificial. So, but it really depends. Like planting native things and very variable habitats will provide a lot of habitat for beneficials that will go attack those insects and kill them, but you're rarely going to get 100% control of beneficials, stuff like that. So it really depends on your situation. You have to say, okay, these plants are getting infested year after year by this, what do I do? Rather than, how do I just completely keep my landscape free of these things? Because we don't want that either. So, let's see. I don't know why it's not finding them.
And just for folks who are curious, we do have a class later in the series that's all about integrated pest management, so we do go into all of that, but we just want to get this first, because like Matt was saying, idea is always the first step.
So this is one of my favorite area fire mites. So that, you can see it's, so that's the mite. And now if you put it on a slide, that's how we identify them, all this wax goes away. And so they produce this wax and these really crazy plates and all this stuff. This is found on sweet gum. Anybody know sweet gum? It's a very common, fairly weedy tree, but it's a very common native plant. You will never see the damage from this because it doesn't damage leaves. So you wouldn't even notice it unless you're actually looking at the leaves and looking for these little tiny white specks on there. Once you magnify it, you see how amazingly beautiful it is. And then, if I can find the other ones. Am I not spelling that right? I'll just put mite. You're gonna have to see all the mites. Okay, so there's lots of cool mites out there. You might see velvet mites out there, these little red kind of walking strawberries.
Wait,
What's that?
sorry, can you go up?
Yeah.
Is that a?
Which one?
Go down, one?
Yeah.
Yeah, up, one?
This?
Yeah.
So this is actually, it's daddy long legs, but it's got a parasitic mite on it. You see it sucking the blood.
Okay.
So if you take photos of any of these things, you're often going to find parasitic mites. These are actually the babies, the larvae of the velvet mites. The velvet mites are predators, and then when they're young, many of them suck the blood. These are actually related to chiggers too. So those are the ones that feed on humans and animals. Here's that Aryophyte on the poison ivy. So again, I'd love to see that. It's like, yeah, that ivy is suffering. Here's a very famous mite. Very famous mite. One of the biggest pests of bees. They actually they feed on the fat bodies and they can transmit viruses. So that's a little mite. That's actually related to ticks and some of the blood feeding mites that are out there that feed on humans. And so that's on a bee right there. Like I said, mites are really cool. A lot of mites actually just crawl around on beetles and other insects to hitch rides to other areas. And so they're just, I would hate to have a giant, almost like chihuahua sized thing on me. But where is it? Oh, so here, this is one of my favorite. So this is another Aryophyte mite. Again, those are the wax bands on it and everything. This is a new species on cast iron plant. And you can see though the cells of the plant right here and the stomates. That's how tiny these mites are. I could talk all about mites all day. We got a couple more minutes. Oh, that's us. That's our group sampling face mites from E.O. Wilson. Yeah. so yeah, and oh, here you go. Here's spider mite feet. Well, these are the feet of a relative of spider mites called the clover mite. And so They're really funky, and this is what the actual adults look like on vetch. So these little kind of leggy things. This is actually at one of the offices down east. We were looking at stuff around, and this was a really cool one that we found. I was able to ID for that one to species, which was fun. And then, but they're everywhere. Just mites are just everywhere. And here's another one of those area-fied mites on a magnolia. They look like little bugles, those little snacks, I think. Yeah.
That one is with the black background?
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is another one where, this is really cool. This is a baby plant hopper. And yeah, they're really, really funny looking. They look like they got the psychedelic eyes and they produce the wax. These little hoppers, this is related to a spotted lanternfly, but it's not a pest like that. Here's actually the mouth part, again, sucking buds. But this was found in the mite part because they're, six-legged larval parasitic mite that's feeding on the blood of it. They basically bore into the exoskeleton and suck the blood. Yep, there's lots of weird mites out there. And you have them in your faces too? Not doing any problem? Yeah, yes?
Do you have anything named after you?
Not yet. We'll see. I have some friends that might. I don't know. We'll see. Maybe. But no. And I'm now an author on 3 different types of animals or different things. So a bee fly from Madagascar I helped describe. So my name will be attached to it forever as an author. And then that mite, and then a flatworm now. So yeah. You might have seen that in the news. The new flatworm in the southeast. It was about 6 months ago. They were touting it because and it came through the clinic. So yeah.
What kind of flatworm was it?
It's a one of the predatory, not a hammerhead worm, but a predatory flatworm. Non-native. But it was described. The type locality is now North Carolina, which is funny. So, but it's almost certainly not from here. So yeah.
What camera are you using to get these shots?
I use my Canon SLR with a macro lens and some other things, but
Okay.
yep, that's what. That poor beetle. But these aren't feeding on the beetle; they're just hitching rides and stuff. And in fact, some beetles, like the burying beetles, they bury little like birds and rodents, dead rodents and birds, and the male and female come and mate, and they bury this together and raise their young. They actually have a type of mite that lives with them that is really beneficial in most cases, where they'll ride on these beetles, and then when they make this little home, the mites will disperse and they'll feed on the maggots and the worms and the things like that that'll try and eat the babies or compete with the babies. But apparently if there's too many of the mites and there's not enough food and stuff, they'll start eating other things that they shouldn't. So, but they, live in these little mutualisms and everything. So, yeah.
Just going back to something before, do scale insects harm the plant that they're on?
So in some cases, yes. So I would say scale insects are very normal on plants everywhere. A few here or there.
Take them off when you see them.
Well, taking them off is probably futile because there's a lot of them that you don't see probably. I would say it depends on the plant. What you like, what type of scale it is, and all that stuff. So, for instance, T-scale on camellias, very common, very slow infesting. You almost always see them in the old growth. You could sit there and just go one day and pick all the leaves off, the old leaves off of it. You'd destroy the population almost, and they're not going to kill that plant. Euonymus scale, on the other hand, a close relative, is going to encrust that euonymus, and if the plant can't out-compete it, they will kill that plant and everything. So it really depends on the situation. Again, if the plant is happy and healthy, there aren't a lot of pests that are just going to outright kill plants and stuff like that out there. Again, the borers, the things that are eating the roots or boring into the stems are really hitting the lifeline of the plant. Or if they overwhelm it and you get like just complete, it's a young plant, it's more susceptible, and it gets overwhelmed by bagworms year after year, it's going to not be able to produce enough energy to grow and be thrifty. But yeah, so that you got to kind of look at it on a case-by-case basis, but there are definitely certain things that, like I said, euonymus scale is one that we know can kill the plants and stuff.
So those webworms and tent caterpillars,
Yeah.
you just leave them?
Yeah, I mean I would say that's I think the biggest thing to understand and the hardest thing to understand is that just because something looks bad doesn't mean it's going to be really bad for the plant or whatever. unfortunately, we like our plants to look good and perfect, and that's not always the case. And the plants don't necessarily care. They can't see themselves. They don't know. I mean, they're just like, whatever. Okay, I have a branch here, there, missing. We care more about those plants than they do about themselves in a lot of ways, or over care about them maybe. So yeah. Yes.
Do you,
Oh.
do you find iNaturalist to be a good resource? I know obviously for things that need slides or you know.
It can be for certain things.
Okay.
I use it for moths often because they're some of the ones I don't recognize. It's got good, lots of photos of them. They've got good color recognition, things like that, pattern recognition. But I wouldn't trust a lot. I would definitely check everything that you get on there. Yeah. Yes.
So with the insect clinic, is it specifically insects? So like obviously the anthropods or the arachnids would fall under your clinic, and like with worms?
Yeah, technically, I handle worms a little bit. Yeah, any invertebrate. Actually, I handle all the animals that come through, so even woodpeckers and stuff like that. But our clinic deals with diseases, plant disease and arthropod pests. And if it's not one of those, we can help rule those out basically, and say, okay, it's probably something nutritional or something environmental or something like that. So.
Are there any issues with worms?
What kind of worm? Again, worm. Yeah, see, that's the problem with worm. Yeah, that's why we use scientific names. So. Flatworms are predators. Thing that people are scared of is that some produce toxins and people are just grossed out by them. I think that's really but they're only going to feed on like snails and earthworms and stuff like that. Now earthworms people love, but there's also jumping worms, things like that they're really destructive. They eat that kind of leaf litter, but they don't actually till the soil or do anything. In fact, most of the earthworms we have in North Carolina are not native. In fact, in the U.S., 60% of the species are non-native because the glaciers came down and killed all the worms in most of the U.S., the northern U.S. Now, we're in a weird area where we have maybe some native ones, but most of the worms you see are non-native. People love them because they till the soil, all that stuff, but these worms are bad because they're big and annoying and stuff like that. But it really depends on what type of worm you're talking about. Okay, one last question, I guess, because I think Ashley was probably yes.
Oh, is it me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. As someone who has jumping worms, I would love to hear the status of jumping worm research. If you know, like, what is going on with jumping worms?
Yeah, I don't really know what the current status is. Jumping worms are really difficult to control because anything you'd use on them would kill other earthworms and stuff. There's not a really, I would say if you have jumping worms recurring year after year or whatever, one thing you can do is they luckily only have one generation a year too. So in most of the year they're developing, they're not mating until the late summer, fall. So if you're digging around or if you want to do a really big effort, go around and collect as many earlier in the year as you can. Break it up and try and destroy them, drown them in water or whatever. But that there's not any chemical control. There's not, and they can vary year to year. I think. Sounds like you have a good habitat though, but yeah. Yeah. So. All right. Well, I'm gonna head out after that but thank you for listening and being a great group and all that stuff. Yeah.